Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at what's really motivating Russia when it comes to military AI. You know, we always hear those crazy headlines about killer robots.
Oh, yeah,
But today, we're going beyond that hype.
definitely.
Our main source is a 2022 report. It's from the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and it's called Russian Perceptions of Military AI, Automation, and Autonomy.
Okay.
It's by Anna Nadezhbade. So if you're ready to dive into some serious geopolitical realities, let's go.
Sounds good to me.
Okay, so it's easy to get caught up in this whole idea of a global AI race, right? Like, who's
Yeah.
going to be the dominant force?
Right.
But I feel like Russia's motivations are a lot more complicated than that.
Oh, absolutely. Russia has some pretty serious challenges at home that are really driving their interest in military AI. Things like protecting their huge borders.
Those borders are massive.
Yeah, and they have a shrinking military personnel pool.
Right.
Plus, they've always had this historical thing about maintaining their status as a major global power.
We've all heard Putin's statement about AI leadership, basically leading to world domination.
Right.
But I'm guessing there's more to it than that, would you say?
Definitely. Way more to it.
So how does all this technological innovation in the military actually translate into that great power status? Like, what does that actually look like?
Well, for Russia, military strength is a huge part of how they project their power and influence on the world stage. You know, it's all about national pride, demanding recognition,
Oh, for sure.
and just being seen as a force to be reckoned with.
So it's almost like these advanced weapons systems become symbols of their identity as a nation.
Exactly. Exactly. Think back to the Soviet era, right?
Mm.
The space race, the development of nuclear weapons.
Oh, yeah.
This was all about showing off their technological power and making sure everyone knew they were a major player on the world stage.
Mm.
Military AI is just the latest chapter in that story.
That makes a lot of sense. So beyond this idea of national pride and prestige,
Right.
what are some of the concrete practical challenges that Russia is trying to address with military AI?
Well, let's start with those huge borders, like you mentioned. Russia has the longest coastline in the world,
It's crazy how big it is.
and they share borders with 14 different countries. That's a lot of territory to patrol, especially when you consider those harsh environments like the Arctic. They're turning more and more to AI-powered systems like unmanned aerial vehicles,
What?
drones, and even underwater robots.
Whoa, underwater robots in the Arctic.
Yeah, to monitor those remote areas.
That sounds incredibly difficult. What are they hoping to do with that technology? What's the goal?
Well, one example is these underwater robots designed to patrol the Arctic continental shelf.
Okay.
Safeguard drilling platforms
Right.
and monitor underwater infrastructure.
Yeah.
Think of it as a way to extend their reach in a really strategically important region.
So it's not just about protecting themselves, it's about protecting their economic interests up there in the Arctic, too.
Exactly. And speaking of practical applications, do you remember the Uran-9, the unmanned combat ground vehicle?
Oh, yeah. Wasn't that deployed in Syria?
Yeah, back in 2018. And let's just say the results were, well, they learned a lot from that experience.
Yeah, I read about that. It seemed like there were some technical glitches and limitations.
There were reports of communication problems, limited mobility in cities.
Also, like in urban environments?
Yeah, and even cases where the human operators had to take over.
Really?
But the point is that Russia is willing to test these systems in real-world situations.
So they're not just messing around in a lab somewhere. They're actually putting these things to the test.
Oh, yeah. They're learning and improving as they go.
So they've got the drive. They've got the ambition.
Right.
But are they facing any roadblocks in their AI development? What are the challenges that might be holding them back?
Oh, there are definitely some hurdles. One big one is a lack of specialists. There's a brain drain happening.
What do you mean by brain drain?
A lot of their top tech talent is leaving Russia for better opportunities in other countries.
So they're losing their best people.
Yeah, unfortunately. And another problem is their reliance on foreign hardware, especially semiconductors.
Oh, so they're kind of dependent on other countries for some pretty crucial components.
Yeah, which makes them vulnerable, especially with all the geopolitical tensions going on.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, so they're dealing with some internal limitations. But I'm wondering about something else. How much does Russia consider the ethical side of weaponized AI? I feel like that's a question on a lot of people's minds these days.
That's a tough one. And the report highlights some interesting contradictions. Publicly, on the international stage, Russia downplays the whole idea of fully autonomous weapons.
Oh, so they're saying, hey, we're the good guys.
Yeah, emphasizing human control and all the risks of AI. But then domestically, they've announced that they're producing autonomous combat robots.
So which is it? Are they building killer robots or not?
It's a bit of a mixed message, right? It could reflect some internal debates within the Russian government and the military.
So maybe they haven't fully figured out their stance on this yet?
It's possible. There's this quote from Putin that I always find interesting. He said that artificial intelligence doesn't have compassion, a conscience, or a soul.
Yeah, I've heard that one.
But it could be a useful assistant, even a teacher.
So it's almost like he's acknowledging the potential dangers of AI while also seeing its potential as a tool.
Exactly. He seems to be drawing a line between using AI to help humans and letting it make life or death decisions on its own. But how that'll actually play out, we just don't know yet.
It's like you might use AI to help you learn something new, but you wouldn't want it to make decisions about whether someone lives or dies.
Precisely.
So we've got this internal struggle over the ethics of AI, and at the same time, they're trying to position themselves on the world stage as, a responsible player in this whole emerging field. How does that work? How do they reconcile those two things?
That's where it gets really interesting. At the United Nations, particularly in those discussions about lethal autonomous weapons systems, WALOS, they call them Ariane,
Okay.
Russia has always opposed any ban or new regulations.
So are they just trying to slow down any restrictions on how they develop AI?
It might be more than that. It seems like they want to be seen as a key player in this whole global AI conversation. They want to have a say in shaping the rules of the game, not just following rules set by someone else.
It's like they want a seat at the table where the decisions are being made.
Exactly. And one of the ways they do that is by pointing to their experience in Syria. They highlight how effective their automated systems were there, especially things like machine vision.
Like the ability for machines to see and interpret what they're seeing.
Exactly. It's their way of saying, hey, we've got real-world experience with this technology. We're not just talking about it theoretically.
So they're using their actions on the ground to influence this global discussion about AI. It's very strategic. But how do they balance this desire for influence with those ethical concerns we were just talking about? Doesn't that seem a little contradictory?
Absolutely. They're walking a tightrope, trying to advance their AI capabilities without being seen as reckless or irresponsible.
It sounds like a high-stakes game of chess, and the future of warfare is hanging in the balance. This has been a fascinating deep dive so far. We've learned that Russia's pursuit of military AI is all tangled up with their national identity, these practical challenges they face, and this desire to shape the future of warfare.
Exactly. It's a complex issue with a lot of moving parts, and guess what? We're not done yet. There's still so much to unpack, like how all of this might reshape the global balance of power.
One thing that's really interesting is how different Russia's approach to developing AI is compared to other major players like the US and China.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. What are the main differences? And how do you think that could impact this whole global AI landscape everyone's talking about?
Well, one of the biggest differences is the level of involvement from the private sector. In the US and China, you've got those tech giants like Google, Microsoft, Baidu, Tencent.
They're all in on AI.
They're pouring tons of money into AI research and development.
It's almost like you've got Silicon Valley leading the charge over there.
I can't even think of a Russian equivalent.
Right. In Russia, it's mostly state-controlled corporations and institutions leading the way. So it's much more centralized, top-down.
So less of that startup energy, more government-directed.
Yeah, pretty much.
I wonder what kind of implications that has. Does it give them an advantage in some ways, or does it hold them back?
It's hard to say for sure. It could slow things down, that energy from the private sector. They're willing to take risks.
Yeah, they move fast and break things, right?
Exactly. And that can be harder to create in a government-led system.
That makes sense. But couldn't you argue that a more centralized approach might actually be more efficient in some ways?
Oh, definitely.
Like maybe it leads to better coordination, more focus on specific goals?
Absolutely. There are arguments to be made on both sides. It's a classic trade-off, right?
Right.
You either go for control and focus, or you try to create an environment where things move quickly, even if it's a bit messy.
And only time will tell which approach really wins out. It's fascinating to think about how these different approaches are shaping the global AI landscape. We're basically seeing these entirely new dynamics emerge in geopolitics and technology.
Totally agree. And remember, it's not just about who develops the most advanced AI, it's about how they choose to use it.
Right.
What kind of controls and safeguards are in place. And that's where those ethical considerations we talked about become super important.
Speaking of ethical considerations, the report talks about Russia's stance on autonomous weapons systems, or LAWS for short, at the UN.
Right.
What's their position on that, especially with all this focus on AI development?
So Russia has consistently been against any kind of international ban on laudable uses. Their argument is that it would stifle technological progress and put them at a disadvantage.
So they're basically saying innovation over potential risks.
Well, they do say that humans should always be in control of weapon systems, but they're also really worried about being left behind in this AI arms race.
So they want to have their cake and eat it too.
Pretty much. It's a tricky position to be in.
All right, they want to seem responsible on the world stage, but they also don't want to fall behind.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that Russia isn't the only country struggling with this. Lots of countries are trying to figure out this whole AI and warfare thing.
It's not just a Russia problem, it's a global challenge.
Exactly. We need to move past those scary headlines about killer robots
Yeah, for sure.
and have a real conversation about how to set some ethical guidelines and norms for how AI is developed and used in warfare.
Completely agree. But maybe we can save that bigger conversation for another deep dive. For now, let's focus back on Russia's ambitions. We've talked about their motivations, the potential benefits and risks of military AI, and their position on the world stage. But what does all this actually mean for the future of warfare? How might their pursuit of military AI change the battlefield as we know it?
Now that's where things get really interesting. Okay, so let's imagine Russia actually does become a leading power in military AI. Like they've overcome all those challenges we talked about, the brain drain, relying on other countries for tech, and now they're building cutting-edge systems, using them in their military strategies, deploying them effectively.
Okay, I'm trying to picture this. They've got their AI drones in the air, autonomous tanks on the ground, those underwater robots patrolling the oceans. Then what? What does that world actually look like?
It would likely mean a huge shift in the balance of power. Russia would have a big military advantage, especially in areas like electronic warfare, cyber warfare, maybe even managing nuclear weapons.
Whoa, so we're not just talking about robots fighting on a battlefield. This could change everything about how wars are fought, even impacting the most dangerous weapons out there.
It really could. And it's bigger than just military power, too. Russia could use AI for political and economic gains. Think about their influence in the Arctic, for example.
Right, with those underwater robots and everything.
Exactly. They could have a big advantage in things like resource extraction and territorial disputes.
So it's like a ripple effect. It starts with the military, but then it impacts geopolitics, economics, even global security. It's kind of scary to think about.
It definitely raises a lot of questions about the future. And that's why we need that global conversation about AI we talked about before. We can't just sit back and watch as these technologies change the world around us. We need to be proactive.
Okay, so let's say this does happen. Russia becomes an AI superpower. What does that mean for countries like the U.S.? Do they just try to catch up, or is there another way?
The US and other Western powers are definitely investing a lot in AI, but it shouldn't just be an arms race. We need more international cooperation. We need clear ethical guidelines and a focus on using AI responsibly.
So instead of focusing on who has the best tech, we need to focus on creating rules for how AI is used by militaries.
Exactly. And it's not just up to governments and militaries to solve this. Civil society, researchers, the tech industry, everyone needs to be involved in shaping the future of AI.
Wow, this deep dive has been a lot to process. We've gone from robots patrolling the Arctic to the global balance of power and how AI could change the very nature of war. It's been intense, but I feel like I have a much better understanding of what's going on.
Definitely a lot to think about, but it's crucial to be aware of these issues. That's what these deep dives are all about, giving you the information you need to think critically and draw your own conclusions.
And on that note, I think it's time to wrap things up. We've covered so much ground today. Russia's motivations, the potential benefits and risks of military AI, what all this means for the future of warfare. But as we end this episode, I want to leave you with one final thought. If AI really does become this huge force in warfare, what does that mean for war itself? Will wars be more or less likely, more or less destructive? And will humans even be in control anymore? We don't have those answers yet, but they're questions we need to start asking ourselves now. Before it's too late, thanks for joining us, and we'll see you on our next deep dive.